The first thing people remember about the case is the photograph, a grainy image captured on a body camera. A young woman sitting on the curb in handcuffs, a police officer standing beside her. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary arrest, the kind that happens every night in quiet towns across America. But if you watch closely, something about the moment feels different. The officer isn't looking at the camera. He's looking at her. And she's looking right back. Months later, that same officer would become the prime suspect in a mysterious death. And the woman he arrested would become the center of a story that no one could fully explain. Because somewhere between that quiet roadside arrest and a body discovered in a small apartment across town, something had gone terribly wrong. The town of Brookdale was the kind of place where very little ever happened. A quiet suburban community just outside a mid-sized city, Brookdale was known for tree-lined streets, tidy homes, and a police department that handled more parking violations than violent crime. Officer Ethan Caldwell had worked there for nearly 6 years. He was the kind of officer people trusted. Calm, professional, soft-spoken. At 32, Caldwell had built a reputation for being patient with suspects and respectful with residents. He wasn't the type who looked for trouble. In fact, most people said he actively avoided it. Which is why the events that followed would leave the entire department stunned. Because it all began with a routine traffic stop. It was late on a Thursday evening when dispatch called in a report about a vehicle swerving between lanes on Riverside Drive. Caldwell responded within minutes. When he found the car, it was pulled halfway onto the shoulder, engine still running. Inside sat Leila Monroe. Her eyes were red. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. Caldwell approached cautiously. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle." Leila complied without argument. The roadside test was brief. The result was clear: driving under the influence. It wasn't a serious crime in Brookdale, but it was still an arrest. Caldwell placed the handcuffs gently on her wrists. And that's when something strange happened. Instead of anger or fear, Leila laughed. Not loudly, just a small, exhausted laugh. "I guess tonight just keeps getting worse," she said quietly. Caldwell looked at her. "What do you mean?" Leila hesitated. Then she said something that would later echo in investigators' minds again and again. "Nothing," she said. "Just bad timing." At the time, Caldwell didn't think much of it. He drove her to the station, completed the paperwork, and processed the charge. But something about her lingered in his mind. Maybe it was the way she spoke. Maybe it was the sadness in her voice. Or maybe it was the way she looked at him when he removed the handcuffs. Like she was seeing someone she already knew. But there was one problem. Something Caldwell didn't know yet. Leila Monroe hadn't come to Brookdale alone. Somewhere else in town, there was someone who still believed she belonged to him. A man who hadn't accepted the breakup. His name was Daniel Voss. And before this story was over, he would be the one found dead. Leila Monroe had lived in Brookdale for just under a year. Originally from another state, she had moved to the town after accepting a position as a graphic designer for a small marketing company. Friends described her as quiet, but warm, creative, thoughtful, a little guarded. Her life in Brookdale had been relatively uneventful, until the arrest. 2 weeks later, she returned to the police station to finalize paperwork related to her case. Caldwell happened to be working the front desk that afternoon. When she walked in, both of them froze for a moment. Then Leela smiled. "Looks like we meet again," she said. Caldwell nodded politely, but something had shifted. What followed was small talk, then longer conversations. Eventually, they started meeting outside the station. At first it was coffee, then dinners, then long evening walks along the river. The relationship developed slowly, cautiously. Both of them knew the situation was complicated. Police officers were strongly discouraged from forming personal relationships with individuals they had arrested or investigated. But Leela's case was minor, and technically it had already been resolved. Still, they kept things quiet, not secret, but private. Because even in a quiet town like Brookdale, rumors spread fast. For a while, everything seemed normal. Friends noticed Leela seemed happier, more relaxed. Caldwell, usually reserved, started showing up to department gatherings with a rare smile. But not everyone approved. One of the most vocal critics was Detective Marcus Hale. Hale had worked in Brookdale for over 15 years. He believed in strict professional boundaries. When he learned about Caldwell's relationship with Leela, he confronted him directly. "You arrested her," Hale said bluntly. "It was a DUI," Caldwell replied. "That's not the point." Hale leaned back in his chair. "It's messy, Ethan. These things always are." Caldwell didn't argue, but privately he believed Hale was overreacting. Because to him, the relationship felt genuine, real, and Leela seemed to feel the same. At least, until later. About 4 months after the arrest, small cracks began to appear. Friends noticed Leela seemed distracted, sometimes anxious. She started missing work occasionally, and more than once, neighbors reported hearing arguments from her apartment late at night. No one knew exactly what those arguments were about, but one name kept coming up: Daniel Voss. Daniel was Leela's ex-boyfriend, a photographer who had moved to Brookdale with her before their breakup. Unlike Leela, Daniel had never fully left. He still lived in town, and according to several friends, he hadn't taken the breakup well. Text messages later recovered from Leela's phone painted a complicated picture. Daniel often asked to meet, sometimes politely, sometimes with messages that sounded less like requests and more like warnings. Caldwell reportedly confronted him once outside a coffee shop. Witnesses described a tense exchange, but nothing violent, just 2 men standing face to face in the middle of the sidewalk. After that, Daniel mostly stayed away, at least publicly. Then, one rainy Monday morning in early November, everything changed. The call came in at 8:14 a.m. A landlord had discovered a tenant unresponsive in an apartment on Maple Street. Officers arrived within minutes. The victim was Daniel Voss. He was lying on the living room floor. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, just a quiet apartment and a man who was clearly dead. The medical examiner would later confirm the cause: poisoning, a chemical compound found in certain prescription medications. But here was the strange part. There was no prescription bottle in the apartment, and no obvious explanation for how Daniel had ingested it. The investigation began immediately, and within hours, one name surfaced: Leela Monroe. Phone records showed Daniel had called her repeatedly in the days before his death. Even more concerning, she had visited his apartment the night before he died. When detectives asked why, Leela didn't hesitate. He wanted to talk, she said. About what? Closure. But investigators soon discovered something else. Someone else had also been near Daniel's apartment that night: Officer Ethan Caldwell.
Security footage from a nearby convenience store showed his patrol car passing the street around 10:40 p.m. When confronted with the footage, Caldwell explained calmly, "I was on patrol." Technically, that was true, but Detective Hale wasn't convinced, because the timeline was tight, very tight. Leela visited Daniel around 9:30 p.m. Caldwell's car passed the area about an hour later. Daniel was estimated to have died sometime after midnight, which meant both of them had been near the apartment shortly before the death, and neither of them had mentioned it. The case quickly became the most talked about investigation Brookdale had seen in decades. A love story, an arresting officer, an ex-boyfriend, and now a poisoning. Rumors spread fast. Some people believed Caldwell had confronted Daniel. Others believed Leela had done something impulsive during their meeting. But investigators soon discovered a third possibility, one that complicated the entire case. Daniel Voss had been investigating something before he died, not as a journalist, not as a detective, just as someone curious. His laptop contained dozens of folders labeled with addresses, photographs, and notes, many of them connected to Brookdale's city officials, financial records, construction permits, property sales, and buried inside one folder was a single photograph. It showed Officer Ethan Caldwell standing outside a building late at night. The timestamp was 2 months before Daniel's death, and Caldwell had never reported being there. When detectives showed him the image, he looked genuinely confused. "I don't remember this," he said. But Detective Hale wasn't convinced, because Daniel's files suggested he believed something illegal was happening in Brookdale, something involving multiple people, something he had been quietly documenting, which raised a chilling possibility. What if Daniel didn't die because of love? What if he died because he knew something? Suddenly, the case was no longer just about a relationship. It was about motive and secrets. Leela insisted she had nothing to do with Daniel's death. Caldwell insisted the same, but investigators kept digging. Then they found the final clue, a voicemail Daniel had recorded the night before he died. His voice sounded nervous, rushed. "If anything happens to me, check the blue folder, the one labeled Riverside. That's where it all starts." The blue folder contained documents tied to a construction project on Riverside Drive, a project approved by the City Council earlier that year. One of the permits had been signed by a councilman who was later arrested for fraud. And the building site in the photographs, it was the same location where Caldwell had been photographed months earlier, standing alone in the dark. The case quickly spiraled into something far bigger than anyone expected. Was Caldwell involved in something illegal? Had Daniel discovered it? Or was the photograph simply a coincidence? In the end, investigators could never fully prove what happened. The chemical that killed Daniel could have been ingested voluntarily, or given to him by someone he trusted. Leela was never charged. Caldwell was placed on administrative leave, but later cleared of direct involvement. Daniel's investigation into Brookdale's financial dealings quietly disappeared into evidence storage, and the relationship between Leela Monroe and Ethan Caldwell ended almost immediately after the investigation began. Neither of them ever spoke publicly about the case again. But people in Brookdale still talk about that body camera photo, the one taken on the night of the arrest, because if you watch closely, it looks less like the beginning of a romance and more like the beginning of something neither of them ever saw coming. A relationship that started with handcuffs and ended with a question no one could answer. Did Daniel Voss die because of love, or because he discovered something someone desperately wanted to keep hidden? If you believe the relationship between Leela and the officer influenced the investigation, do you think justice was ever fully served? If you believe Daniel's death was not an accident or suicide, who do you think was really responsible? And finally, if you believe cases like this prove that the truth doesn't always come out, tell me what you think really happened that night. Don't forget to comment below with your theory. And if you enjoy chilling true crime stories like this one, make sure you like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more mysterious and thought-provoking true crime cases.